let's get started. The materials you're going to need will be listed down below, but first I have my bug template printed off on some silky stick and stitch. I have a 100% cotton knit garment here. I'm using yarn, that's why we're using a knit garment. But if you want to use DMC embroidery thread on like a cotton shirt, I'll have those instructions down below. Like I said, I'm using yarn here. I like to use a weight 4 for this, and the reason, or the way you can tell, is on the back there's a little skein here, and it'll say medium or 4 on it, and that's the kind you want to look for. It will be about this thickness, and I have a bunch of different colors down below that I used. You're also going to need some scissors and a needle. I'll have my favorite down below, but I like the sharp point ones and a large eye so you can get the yarn through it. And with that, let's get started. Now all of my bug templates do come like this with all 6 of the bugs at the bottom. I find it's helpful to just kind of reference those in case I have a bug covered up and I want to see what it looked like, but also then you get just some extra bugs on the sticker sheet. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that off, but keep it close in case I need to reference it. And I am just going to kind of cut off some of this excess silky stick and stitch. Don't cut off the top though with that little line. You're going to use that to measure it against your sweater to make sure it's centered. So make sure that is nice and intact and we're ready to get started. Now we can go ahead and get started by placing our sticker on our garment. Now I do put a little line at the top of all of my templates here. It's about 1 inch from the top, and I find that works really well for most sweaters to keep that at the collar line. If you're working on something like a newborn sweater, you may have to put this line above that collar line, but again, just kind of eyeball it, make sure it's not too low on the chest. I find 1 inch from that collar really looks the best. I am just going to kind of eyeball this one for placement right here, but I'm not going to stick it all the way down. I'm going to then measure the sides of my garment, and I have about 2.5 inches on this side until I get to that armpit seam, and then again about 2.5 inches on this side. So I am happy with that placement. Again, it is kind of hard on these knit sweaters because they do kind of move around a little bit. You can also count the number of stitch lines and see if there's the same number on both sides, but again, take that with a grain of salt because sometimes these kind of move around. So I do find eyeballing does work the best for this, but these are just some tips so you can try to get it as straight as possible. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm going to go ahead and press my sulky down really firmly on the sweater to make sure it adheres, and now we can go ahead and get started with stitching. I am going to start with the bee here, so I have about 4 feet of my yellow weight 4 yarn here that I'm going to get threaded on my needle. I will have all of the colors I use for every single one of the sweaters down in the description box below, but if you have any questions, please let me know. I do have some tips for threading the yarn onto the needle if you have trouble with them, so just ask me down below and I will help you, but I find just kind of wetting it a little bit and poking it through like this is the best way to go about it. You might have to cut that yarn just to get a sharper tip, but I promise it can get through the eye of this needle, and this is the perfect needle for this project. Again, I like to leave a tail on my needle so that the yarn doesn't pop off, and now we can go ahead and get started. I have you zoomed in here now, and we're going to come up through the back of this sweater, so make sure you're just in that top left of the bee here. We're going to poke our needle up on the outline of that yellow for the bee. I'm going to pull that all the way through. If you get any of these little like yarns stuck, you can kind of just use your thumb to make sure they don't pull too far. This does happen occasionally with knit embroidery. Make sure to leave that tail on the back. We will use this to tie off with later. About 4 to 6 inches should do. Now we're going to learn how to do a satin stitch. So I like to push my needle down into the bottom layer of that bee. So kind of right on the outline of that yellow. I'm going to push my needle down and pull that through. I'm trying to keep these lines very parallel to the black lines already established on the bee. That way it looks very, straight and there's no crooked yarn work here. So again, I'm going to come up on the top of the bee, right on the outline of that yellow, pull it all the way through. And then you can kind of pull the yarn down to see how it will look when you pull it through. I had a little snag in the back that I had to fix there. So I pull it down, and then if you want to do a little quicker technique, you can go down through the bottom and back up through the top. If you find this too difficult, keep just going the way we have been doing it, coming up and then going down in 2 separate motions, but I like to save steps wherever I can. We're going to continue this process all the way along our bee. I kind of, again, like to keep those black lines as my pacers to make sure I'm staying up and down and vertical on this bee till I get to the end. Again, you kind of just see me fine-tuning my pieces here. Go slow, especially if this is your first time doing a satin stitch. It is considered one of the more difficult stitches in embroidery, so don't feel bad. I'm going to do this all the way until I get to the end of the bee, making sure my lines are kind of smaller on the outsides and longer in the insides to keep that oval shape of the bee. Once you get to the end here, it might be a little hard to see that last stitch, but I'm just going to place this last stitch down in the bottom right on the outside of that yellow, finishing off my bee. Again, you'll notice that my stitches kind of grow to be big in the middle, and then they come back to be a little smaller on the outsides so that you get that nice oval shape of the bee. I'm just kind of noticing a little thread poked through, so I'm just going to use the back of my needle to push it back through, and now I'm happy with this. On the back of the garment, you'll notice the yarns are a little separated, so I am going to kind of use my needle to navigate to the back. You can tie it off like this, but then that kind of leaves you with gaps that little fingers could get stuck in, and that just makes me nervous. So I like to always navigate back to the original piece of yarn and then tie it off with a triple knot. Again, this just helps things be a little bit cleaner on the inside. And since these are going to little kids, I like to make sure that little fingers cannot get stuck in my embroidery work whenever I can. So I like to tie these off with a triple knot, and I like to go over on one side, and then that same piece I'm going to go back over again, kind of just reversing the direction of my stitches or my knots, and this just makes it a little more durable. It's kind of equivalent to a square knot if you've ever done that in Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts. Once I'm done, I'm going to snip the excess, leaving about 1/4 inch of yarn so it doesn't unravel, and I think that's perfect. So once you're satisfied with that, you can go ahead and get started with the next stitch. Next, we're going to add our black or brown stripes to our bee. I have about 2 feet of a dark brown yarn here that I'm going to use for my stripes. And I'm just going to kind of go ahead and visualize where I want to put my stripes. So I'm going to bring my bee back just so I can kind of see where I want those stripes to be. You can also use a water-soluble marker to mark off on top of the yarn where you want the stripes to be. But I'm just going to kind of eyeball it here because I think bees are a part of nature and they're not going to be perfect. And I think they look really cute when each of them is a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on my stripes now that I'm happy with my general placement that I thought of in my mind. I'm just going to go up at the top again, trying to make sure that I don't snag any yellow yarn. You'll see here I actually do snag a bit of yellow yarn and I don't notice it. So I actually went back and fixed this bee at the end. But just try to go below or above that yellow so it looks like the stripes are on top and not kind of in between. I don't know if that makes sense, but just make sure the yellow isn't poking out of the top or the bottom and it really looks like that stripe is on top of the bee. So I'm just going to go ahead and do my 3 stripes here, and then just like the yellow yarn, we're going to tie it off in the back with a triple knot, making sure we navigate back to the original piece of yarn. Next, we're going to get started on the wings of our bee. So I have about 2 feet of white yarn on my thread here and on my needle, and I'm going to bring it up through the back of the sweater, right at the base of those wings, again, trying to make sure I don't snag any yarn. Then I'm going to go back down through that same hole we just created and then come up along that first black dot on one of the wings. Make sure your yarn is behind your needle so that when you pull through, you create this nice little loop. Stop once you feel any bit of resistance. You don't want to over tighten this, and then poke your needle back down through that same hole you just created. This is called a detached chain stitch or a lazy daisy stitch, depending on who you ask. Now you can either do the same thing on the other wing, or you can double up this chain stitch technique to kind of make it a fluffier wing. So I'll show you that here, but I'll also show you what it looks like with just one done. So again, I'm just going to kind of go down through that same hole we just created, and then notice how I'm coming up just right above that first little stitch at the top of the wing, pulling that through. And you'll notice once I pull it through, it kind of like secures that inside loop as well. Again, just placing it down in that same hole you just created and pulling it through. And then you kind of get this like fluffy effect. You're going to complete that process on the other side, and there you have it. Make sure to tie that off, and there's your first little bee. I didn't record a horizontal video, so this is what your bees would look like if you just did the single chain stitch for them. Now we're going to go ahead and get started with our dragonfly. I love this stitch so much. So I have about 2 feet of my blue yarn here on my needle. Again, making sure to leave that tail so it doesn't pop off. And we're going to go right in between all of the wings. So you can't really see the dot that well here, but there is kind of a dot right in the middle of all of those wings. And you're going to go through the same hole for every set of wings here. So just like the bee, we're going to do a detached chain stitch or a lazy daisy stitch, going down through that same hole and then coming up on that black dot of one of the wings. I'm just going to do a single chain stitch or lazy daisy here for the dragonflies. I think it looks really dainty, but you could also double up this stitch if you wanted to. Again, place that needle back down through the same hole you just created and pull it through to create that first little wing. I'm going to do this on all 4 of the wings, and I'm going to come up in the same hole in the center for every single one. It might be a little hard at the end, but I promise it'll look really cute for your dragonfly if you keep them all in that same hole, so it kind of looks more like the effect a dragonfly would give. Now I'm going to thread about 2 feet of black yarn on my needle here, and I'm going to do the body of the dragonfly. So this is going to be a simple back stitch with a chain stitch for the head. So you're going to see me come up here right at the base of the head here, and I do have it kind of outlined here, but feel free to eyeball it if it doesn't look good for you. And I'm just going to go down through that same hole, again doing that detached chain stitch. And notice how I kind of just went outside of the head a little bit. I did end up going back and fixing the template for these, so yours should be good, but I did have to go a little further on my template when I was filming this. Pull that through, and then again, similar to all the other lazy daisy stitches we have been doing, go back down through the top there and kind of secure that little chain stitch, and it makes kind of this nice little head for your dragonfly. Now to continue the rest of the body of the dragonfly, we are going to do back stitch. So to do that, we're going to come down about, I want to say, 1/4 of an inch away from the head, making sure we stay on that line of the dragonfly body. Pull that all the way through, and then the back stitch part is going back towards the same stitch we had just stitched. So that, in our case, it will be the base of the head of the dragonfly, but in the previous ones, you'll see what I mean. So again, we're going to kind of go down that dragonfly body. Again, about 1/4 of an inch. I noticed 3 to 4 stitches work best for this dragonfly. So again, you see me kind of coming down 1/4 of an inch away from our previous stitch, and then we can kind of come back and go down through that same hole from the prior stitch. Again, you're just making a very straight line here for our dragonfly body, but that's what back stitch is. I'm going to finish this off, and then you can tie that off with a triple knot in the back of the sweater to make sure it's nice and secure. And there you have it, a cute little dragonfly. Next, we're going to get started on our moth. So again, I have about 2 to 3 feet of yarn on my needle here in this beautiful orange color, and we're going to do some very similar stitches here. So starting at the base of the moth, right in the middle of those 2 wings, I like to keep this right kind of at the top of the moth head there, so that black piece. So right in the middle of those 2 wings, we're going to bring our yarn up. And again, very similar to all the other stitches, we're going to go down through that same hole, coming up right at the tip on that black dot I have for you on the wing. Make sure the yarn is behind the needle so that when you pull through, you get this nice little loop. And again, stitch it down into the same hole you just created. Now, again, for these moths, you can do it just like the bumblebees or the dragonflies with just a single chain stitch or lazy daisy stitch here, but I find it looks really cute when you double these up. So again, all 3 of these stitches can be done with a single or a double chain stitch, but these are just my preferences for what I found looks the best for me. So again, just coming down through that same hole and coming up right along that top stitch, just so it kind of encompasses it and you don't see any white space down below. You could even do 3 stitches if you wanted to and really, make it nice and fluffy for the moth, but I found 2 looked really cute. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this down, and then I'm going to complete the same steps on the other wing, and then we can get started on the head. Now for the head of the moth, we are going to do satin stitch just like the bumblebee. So I have about 2 feet of this gray yarn on my needle here. I'm just going to kind of turn you around and zoom you in, but we're just going to do about 3 to 4 satin stitches along this head. And this first one is the most important because I kind of like to hide all of those details of the orange yarn that I kind of messed up. So I'm just going to pull those back so I can really get it nicely aligned with the black template that I have down below and pull that through. Notice how it kind of just hides a little bit of those details from the orange. And then again, just like the bumblebee, we're just going to come up along the bottom of those lines and then stitch it down along the top, making sure we're staying right on the outside of that moth head. Again, I like to do about 3 or 4 stitches here, but just find what works best for you. And again, I like to make sure they're longer at the base of the head and then they kind of get smaller as you go to the top. So it kind of creates that little semicircle effect. And just like all the other bugs, make sure you tie it off on the back with a triple knot, cutting off the excess. And there you have it, a cute little moth. Okay, we do have 3 more bugs to learn, but this is the last one for this sweater. So we're going to be doing this beetle here. I do find this the trickiest of the bugs on this pattern, so by all means save it for last if you want to. We're going to be doing a satin stitch going down along the beetle. So there is a line right in the middle of the beetle, and I'm going to come up through that line. We're going to do the bottom half of our beetle going vertically, so top to bottom. We're going to be doing the same satin stitch we did for the bee and the moth head. So again, just trying to create parallel lines to the beetle and making sure we kind of keep it smaller on the outsides and going longer in the middle to create that bug-like shape. So you're just going to see me here kind of doing a few stitches so you can remember the process of the satin stitch. And I really wanted to show this one because I kind of messed up a little bit. So notice when I pull this through, I made sure it was parallel, but there is kind of a gap in between those first two stitches. So I'm just going to go back and place a stitch in between those first two stitches just to kind of fill it in a little bit. This is totally fine. It's not going to ruin your embroidery at all. And if anything, I would rather you double up your yarn and create a fluffier bug than leave gaps, because the gaps will not look cute, I promise you. So once I pull that through, I can continue the rest of my beetle until I get to the end, doing that satin stitch all the way to the end. Now, once I pull this through, I'm not going to tie off or anything. I'm just going to kind of readjust my sweater because now we're going to do a left to right stitch for the top of the beetle. So I'm going to come up kind of where I first started my stitch. This is the most important one because we want to make sure that there's no white space showing through the beetle when we start this next stitch going from left to right. So I'm going to kind of try to place these really, really close, almost using the same holes from the first set of satin stitches, just so again you don't see any white space poking through the sweater. Do that satin stitch all the way up to the top of the beetle head. I did about 4 satin stitches here to get to that top of the beetle head, and I think it looked perfect. Once you've completed that, you can get about 2 feet of black yarn on your needle so we can do the legs and head and antenna of our beetle. So these are going to be fairly similar to a back stitch, but I'm just going to start at the end of one of my legs. It doesn't really matter which one, but you're kind of just going to go and do a single stitch for every single leg joint. So this first little leg joint, I kind of just do a single stitch, and then notice how I come up at the top of the next one and back stitch back to my previous stitch. Again, this just makes it so you're not poking through the same hole, because then your yarn would kind of just pop into the back and it wouldn't actually be a stitch. So again, just doing a back stitch here for every single leg joint. When you get to the ones that are underneath the beetle, I like to kind of pull the green yarn away so that I can get it really nice and tight and you can't see where the leg kind of connects to the body. So again, just going back down into that same hole we just created from our prior stitch, and this just again makes it so there's no white space showing on your beetle legs. You're going to continue this process all the way around, making sure you complete all of the legs and antenna in that black yarn. And once you're finished, it should look something like this. And again, just tie that off on the back with a triple knot and cut off the excess. But look at how cute that little beetle is. Now we're going to get started on our ladybug design. So I have about 5 feet of red yarn here on my needle, and we are going to be doing a chain stitch circle for the body of this ladybug. So I like to start on one of the ends of the ladybug just so the tail that I tie off on the back doesn't interfere with any of the dots. And we're just going to do a chain stitch, so down through the same hole and then come up about maybe 1/8 of an inch away. I like to keep these really small, especially for this ladybug, so we can make it look circular and not super like clunky and stair-like. Again, down through the same hole we just created and then come up about 1/4 inch away, pulling it through to make those little loops. We're going to continue this process all the way around the circle of the ladybug until we get back to the beginning. Once we get back to the beginning, we're going to do a reverse chain stitch. So using the eye of your needle, thread it under the first chain stitch you did. Pull that all the way through, and then you're going to take the sharp point of your needle and go down through the last chain stitch that you created. We're kind of just, again, doing a reverse chain stitch to tie off this circle, and you'll see when I pull it through here that you can't really see where our chain stitch started or ended. If you're having difficulty with this, you can just go down into the sweater, but I find this makes it look really clean. We're going to do the same process again, doing concentric circles going inward towards the ladybug. I just got a little snag here I have to fix. This happens a lot. I've noticed if I keep my left hand at the back of the garment, I can really notice when I get these little snags so that I can fix them early on in the process, because if I get to the end and I notice this, it's just going to be a mess in the back. So always keep your non-dominant hand in the back to kind of catch those mistakes. So again, just going into the middle now, we're just going to do that chain stitch all the way around. And you'll notice when I pull these through that the yarn barely touches the outside of our ladybug. I would rather do this looser rather than thicker because I can always fill in with back stitches later, but it's really hard to kind of prevent it from buckling in if you do it too thick. So again, you just see me doing that reverse chain stitch here so that you can't see where the ladybug center started or ended. And I was only able to do 2 concentric circles, but see how many you can do with your thickness of yarn, or if you're doing thread, how many it takes to cover up all of the red of the ladybug. I do notice I have one little dot here in the middle. It's not enough to do a chain stitch, so I'm just going to do a simple up and down stitch just to cover up all that red. Honestly, the black of the line of the ladybug probably would have covered this, but I just really didn't want any white showing through, so just one simple stitch here to cover up that middle. Snag my sweater a bit there, pull that through, and then you can tie off the red because we're done with it. Now thread about 2 feet of black yarn onto your needle. You can use a water-soluble marker to mark off the line of the ladybug and the dots if you'd like, or you can use kind of one of the patterns that I have extra on the templates to just kind of see where those lines go. But we are just going to start with the head here, doing some simple satin stitches. So just like the bee and the moth head, just coming up along the outside and then down on the other side. I'm just going to do 2 here kind of to fill it in. You could also do this on the moth head, but I didn't in this video, but it would look really cute if you did. And then again, to fill in those antennas, very similar to the beetle pattern, where you just kind of go up and then kind of pull the yarn back so that you can get under the yarn when you pull the antenna back through. And that just again makes it so there's no white space poking through. Do that on the other side of the antenna head, and then we can get started on the line of the ladybug, which I find to be the most challenging part. So I'm actually going to do a back stitch here. So I'm going to come up about 1/3 of the way, maybe even halfway down the ladybug, trying to again aim for that middle. If you need to do a water soluble marker so you have a better line and clear line of view, I totally understand that. I was just feeling lazy here. We're going to poke that down right at the base of the black and the red where they meet, making sure I would prefer you go over the black than get any red in there because you don't want to see any red. Again, just coming up about another 1/3 of the way down the ladybug, pulling that through and doing a back stitch back into that last little stitch we did, that same hole we just created. And you're going to see me kind of just cheat here and go down to the last stitch. So I did about 3 stitches to get the line of the ladybug. 2 to 4 would probably work best for this though. Pull that through, and if you're happy with that, you can proceed with the dots. Now all we do for the dots is we're going to come up anywhere on our ladybug, and we're just going to go down really closely to that original stitch. Just make sure you're not going down through the same hole, otherwise you'll just pull it through to the back. You'll also notice when I pull this through, I'm not pulling it very tight at all. I kind of create this little loose bubble, and I find that makes the dots look really cute. I do 6 all the way around the ladybug, and then just like we have been doing on all the other bugs, navigate the yarn back to the original piece of yarn and tie off with a triple knot. And there you have your cute little ladybug. Now I am going to go quickly through the butterfly just because it is very similar to the dragonfly, but in this case I ended up doing a double chain stitch just like we did for the bumblebee at the beginning, and then just finishing it off with those back stitches just like we did for the dragonfly. Once you've finished embroidering all of your designs, you can either run it under the faucet until all of the sulky is removed, or my favorite process is just throwing it in the washer on a cold, delicate cycle until all of the sulky is removed. And there you have it. I like to lay these flat to dry. I try to avoid putting them in the dryer as it can cause some fuzziness on your sweaters. And once they're completely dry, you are good to wear or ship out your garment. I hope you guys have loved this tutorial so much, and I look forward to making more tutorials for you in the future. As always, if this was helpful, please follow, subscribe, and like this video as it really helps me push out more content to people that love it. Happy stitching, everyone, and have a good day.